panel, we believe that more options is usually better than less options, and we should diversify the chances of people how they can get economical development. We believe it's better to have them, but China will have its power in both sides of the house. Either with AIIB, either with their China's investment in Africa or something like that. We believe it's much better if it's swayed to the IMF, they gain more power in the IMF. I'm going to explain much more on that comparative. Firstly, let's tackle some of the issues that were brought by the leader of the opposition. One is something to say that in investments, that inflation is bad because people who are investors like to be confident in the market, to control things. Note something. China has really lots of mechanisms to control the inflation. They buy lots of American dollars, and they have really lots of money by which we can control how much of the yuan is actually going to exist in the market. We believe that the ability of China to control the inflation and the value of the yuan is really strong. It's not some like Latin American countries in some of these or something like that. We believe exactly that investors like stability. They don't care whether the inflation is 5 or 10%. If they can predict in 5 or 10 years how much money they need to invest, etc., and how much the revenue will be. So we believe that a certain certainty with China is actually goes on our side. Now, secondly, they say that all the things we say were applied only to the United States because they are the only open economy, that China is not. We believe that factually it is not true. Firstly, China has one of the hugest, markets regarding exporting goods. We don't believe it's a closed economy. Secondly, even in the stock market, we see that lots of people are investing there. We just don't buy this 20 or 30 years ago a long analysis that China is not open market. China is open market. So all the things that they just disregarded, saying that it is only applicable for open market, we believe that simply don't stand you. No, thank you. Then tell you thirdly that it will be better because China basically made their currency pegged or something like that. We believe that one of the conditions on the IMF, you need to know this, for the currency to be accepted is actually that market controls your currency, how much your currency goes up and down. Now finally, we believe that I think that I go to my substantive right now. Now, one point of substantive is no thank you. How is better? Why? Firstly, why more China will invest and more China will be involved in the IMF. Now, recognize, as Mila explained you excellently, that only 5% of the vote they have in the IMF, only 4.6% in the World Bank, similar something for the Asian Development Bank. We believe that we disregarded China. Even though China is the second largest economy, they have lots of power, lots of resources. Now, why is this problematic? Problematic is because they want to be recognized. They want to spread their influence, and they want actually to be seen as a huge economy. They to have ability to invest a lot, to have ability to invest in other countries, etc. We believe they're more likely going to actually take more power in the IMF. Why is that? Two reasons. One is because they see it as a symbolic thing. Now, even though that we usually don't believe that symbolic arguments are the strongest argument in the economic debate, we believe it's really important for the country that was so far disregarded as a really weak and as a really incapable, someone who is not for cooperating with. That symbolism that you take your currency, that means that you accept they are a legitimate agent. Secondly, we believe that since that yuan is one of the currency, that means that they can invest in yuans. It's much cheaper for China to invest in yuan and to bring much more money. Now, note this. The percentage of votes both in IMF and the World Bank and Asian Development Bank depends on how money you invest as a country. We believe that if China can invest money in yuan, can actually give the money to other countries who can borrow in yuan, they will do so more because it will be much cheaper for them to do so through the IMF. Now we believe that most of the countries are more likely going to accept IMF rather than China when they can have the same currency. Now this is comparative. Now the comparative is either take IMF that has really, really bad structural adjustment programs, that have programs that are usually not politically likable, that people don't like their healthcare scraps, that they don't like the austerity measures, etc. They don't like the reducing of labor standards. On the other hand, you have China that goes with their investment and says, look, they're really prone to dictators. Now we believe that one this change, one that China has a chance to do this through the IMF and has more incentive to do this, we believe that they'll do that. Why is that? Because precisely the IMF is the institution that is somehow respected. It has much more credibility because much more control and much more of the countries. And when actually when states can have similar benefits, either from China just going there or China going through the IMF, they'll choose China through the IMF. We believe it's really, really beneficial. Now, why is it beneficial? Precisely because we can control China how they're doing so. Because the IMF has some standards regarding labor, has some standards regarding environment, has some standards whether it is okay to send your just workers to build the infrastructure and leave the countries without the resources. We believe it's really, really bad. No, thank you. Second benefit for that is the change of paradigms within the IMF. Now, we believe that probably in most of the cases, inflation is bad, but we don't believe that inflation is abomination and that we should never actually have any inflation and we should do everything to scrap the inflation. Why? Precisely for the reasons that the media explained to you. The fact that the mechanisms of how we reduce inflation usually are really, really harmful. Usually, those are, no thank you, those are the mechanisms that mean that it's really harder to borrow because it means you make your interest rates higher because you want to have less money in your market, which is bad for enterprises, something that's completely disregarded by the leader of the opposition. Now, we believe that in some cases, the lower inflation is good. In some cases, it is bad. We believe in some cases, structural adjustment programs, no thank you, are good. In some cases, some of them are bad. It is better to have more diversified discourse within the IMF. More diversified discourse can only happen if you have China have more than 5% of the votes. Because if you have so much, if they don't have so much power, if you need like 60% of the vote for any big policy to be passed on, it basically means that the United States has a veto, that China doesn't have any huge influence. We believe that they have now incentives, and they have, firstly, to invest more in the IMF, and secondly, since they invest more, they'll get more votes, and therefore we have more discussion which policies are good, which policies are bad. We believe it's much better to control it that way. Now, finally, we did Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. We believe, firstly, it has a huge problem because countries like the United States don't support it. The United States has huge political backlash not to join to that organization. Secondly, it's only for infrastructure, so it's not also for all the things that we need as the IMF, etc. Thirdly, because China will actually have the biggest influence in the IIB, so we believe it's much better to have big influence, but not as big, not as dominant as that they will have in the IIB. But while comparatively in the IMF, they will have some influence, more influence than now, but not the dominant influence. For all these reasons, we are more than proud to propose this motion.
The opening government team in this debate believes it's really important to symbolically hand over power to China so we can trap them in labour regulations, which the IMF is going to impose on them from above, which run contrary to their current policy. What we've heard from them is just absolutely ridiculous. 2 points in this speech. First, I'm going to look at monetary policy. Secondly, I'm going to look at international institutions and how those have changed as a result of this policy. So first, to monetary policy. So the first thing they tell us is that inflation is really good, guys. 16% inflation would be fantastic. So here is the model that explains why short-run higher inflation might lead to higher output. So imagine you're a business owner who gets prices at irregular intervals. So you note suddenly that prices of your own good are starting to increase. So you think, well, now I'm able to increase my output and as a result gain better results for my company as a result of the fact that my prices have increased. But then sooner enough, a few months down the line, you notice that the prices of all of the inputs you use in production have also increased. So you haven't changed the actual value of the price that you're getting. All you've changed is the measuring stick you're using to determine what the value of currency and value of output is. That's why inflation has a short-run effect in terms of increasing output. But note that this entire model is contingent on this inflation being unexpected, because if it were the case that you already knew that these prices were increasing and knew that every price in the economy was increasing at the same rate, then you wouldn't have fallen into the cognitive trap of believing your own prices are increased. So as a result, you get no actual change in the level of output because it's expected. How do we know it's expected? Because if we buy their analysis, then we'd have to believe that it was going to occur. So if their analysis is true, then we would believe this inflation would occur and there'd be no positive effect in terms of output. So you get no benefits as a result of their higher rate of inflation. Now, given we get no benefits in terms of output, Why do we get harms in terms of higher rates of inflation? So there are a few things. So note that individuals who hold cash are harmed hugely by the ability, by higher inflation occurring. So inflation is fine if you're someone who holds stocks or stock shares or gold or property. They're not fine if you're someone who is a relatively poor individual, and as many people who are in countries that rely on development loans, who are going to be affected by the higher imported inflation from China. The value of their money decreases steadily over time, and those people harmed and hurt as a result. Furthermore, it means that businesses need to change their prices more regularly, which imposes costs upon them, particularly when prices are set at particular levels for particular reasons, and there are more complex interactions at the point that other firms need to change their prices more regularly. Furthermore, there are shoe leather costs in terms of the fact that you need to move more regularly in terms to be able to change your investment decisions as a result of the fact that there's higher inflation. This is why the consensus of economists has been for the last 40 years that low and stable inflation is a good thing, and dramatically breaking with this and going with their new paradigm where China gets to export inflation around the rest of the world is ridiculous. What do we hear from them on the openness of the Chinese economy? So they say, oh, but you were wrong to say that China is a relatively closed economy because they export a lot. So look, the Islamic State exports quite a lot of oil, but they're not an open economy, because one of the key conditions we use to measure openness of an economy is not the amount you're sending abroad, but it's the ability of foreign investors to freely invest within your capital markets. Because our analysis wasn't contingent upon the level of exports or imports of your country. What it was contingent on was the extent to which you're integrated in foreign capital markets, to the extent that there's likely to be relatively low levels of asymmetry between shocks that affect your economy and shocks that affect the rest of the world. I'm going to explain now why this is so important. So throughout 2014, Turkey was hurt hugely by the fact that its currency appreciated massively because it imported the expected tightening in US interest rates as a result of the fact that the US was undergoing its process of tapering in terms of moving interest rates off the zero lower bound. So this occurred with the United States and meant that Turkey was harmed economically as a result. That is far more likely to occur with an economy which isn't bound up with the kinds of shocks that are faced by the rest of the world. So because China is insulated from many of the flows of foreign capital, it's more likely to have idiosyncratic economic shocks faced in terms of its monetary policy, which then affect other countries who have entirely different monetary policy needs to China. Furthermore, we believe the fact that the US has more stable monetary policy institutions, in terms of the Federal Reserve having existed since 1912, means that there's far more stability in terms of what is expected to happen, whereas in China there's an incredibly opaque political process which foreign investors are unable to see into and are unlikely to be able to predict. That's why their claims that the Chinese currency will definitely just slowly decrease under time are false. One, because China pegs its currency at a particular rate, but even if it didn't, to the extent that it was floating, those expectations of a future devaluation would be built into the current price, and because that's how expected values work in financial markets. So as a result, they can't use that as an argument for their side closing.
Okay, so what is your long-run evaluation of how the AIIB is going to function? If the people who take loans from the AIIB, are they going to be more integrated or less integrated in the broader international economy as opposed to a system where they go with the IMF?
So there are an incredibly broad range of players in the AIIB. It's not entirely clear what that institution will look like politically. The main consensus is it will tend to be relatively apolitical in terms of the way it gives out loans because of the ability of many countries to be involved in that. But furthermore, it's likely to just act as a competitor to the World Bank insofar as it fosters an alternative institutional structure for giving out loans. So it's more likely to be an alternative which fosters competition in the development loan market. Why is this important? Because they say that they have the symbolism, the symbolic effect of including China by allowing its currency to be involved within the IMF. They never say why this would have any effect in voting rights, apart from the fact that China may suddenly decide to hand over more money for reasons which were unclear, given that it must have already decided the optimal level of its contributions, given the amount of savor it thinks it can get through the organisation. The fact that some of its loans are denominated in its currency doesn't change what the optimal rate of contribution for China is, so you get no better results as a result. But what happens is China might see the fact that it's going to be involved more in some sort of IMF institutions, and as a result is going to see that it might get some symbolic power if we accept this argument. What that means is it's far less likely to pursue the AIIB as an alternative means of asserting its soft power, and as a result you're far less likely to get an incredibly promising institution position, which is going to be able to provide many of the loans throughout Asia that the IMF and World Bank have traditionally been unwilling to, for political reasons bound up in the participation of the US and Western countries within that institution. So we get more development loans and as a result have a richer and more prosperous world as a result. This is a crazy idea which screws with monetary policy. Please do not vote for this.
Speaker panel, the question of this round is, should the IMF construct their policy through dogmatic economic idealism, or should they work to be a moderating, stabilizing influence in a world that actually recognizes the realities of the global economy and of monetary policy around the world? Recognize that we are seeing the growing influence of China. These are things that they agree with along the op bench. But the problem is that their case entirely self-contradicts itself. How is this true? Recognize that the entire first half of the op case is telling us all the reasons that China, in their economic monetary policies, are extraordinarily damaging to the people that they might be that might take on those reserves were they participating as a recognized IMF currency, right? So they talk about how you would have things like the massive shocks that wouldn't be reflective of the global marketplace, but rather only reflective of the relatively insulated Chinese market, right? The problem is that the second half of their case is like, which is why we should allow them to have an entirely autonomous development bank where the poorest of the poor stake their futures and their development on taking loans from the exact same poor monetary policy that they just said was so damaging, right? This is completely nonsensical. They're like, it's so bad that we couldn't have them in the IMF, so we should just let them do it on their own where there's no moderated influence, and you further alienate the people that need to be taking those loans and need that development from the IMF and any good sense guidance that they might be able to provide if you were able to bring them into the fold. Their case literally defeats itself, and I think that they weren't able to actually articulate the way that they thought that the AIIB was going to be uniquely beneficial. So, what I'm going to talk to you first is about the problems of the AIIB. Then I'm going to talk to you about the true characterization of the IMF and why this allows them to do their job better, as well as lead to better results for both the countries that are largely getting the investments and structural adjustment, as well as for the increased improvement of China and the liberalizations of their markets. So, first, the problems of the AIIB. So, I think that OO already does a pretty good job of illuminating the various problems, or the problems that happen with Chinese monetary policy, right? They already defeat this with their own logic. But we're also going to give you independent reasons, right? Recognize that we'll tell you that the AIIB is developing as a necessary competitor against the World Bank and to some extent the IMF, right? This is what Tom agrees with. The problem is that in order to be a competitor, a lot of the things that China is doing to try and make the IIB seem viable is a combination of two things. One, offering relatively reckless ways to actually develop this investment that makes it seem more appealing to the individuals that they're trying to reach out to, because they're necessarily trying to compete, right? If the World Bank is trying to be relatively sensible and conservative in allowing these things to be economically stable and well thought out, that means that it's going to, in order to seem more appealing, China is often going to try and take advantage of more things that mean there's less conditions on the structural adjustments, there's less conditionality on loans, which might seem appealing to those individual sovereign nations, but actually isn't good for the long-term economic well-being of the individuals that are taking those poor the loans with those poor conditions, right? But recognize that also, we'd simply tell you that the AIIB has a different mandate and a different self-interest, right? This is something that China is trying to do to develop a greater economic sphere of influence, and it's far more self-interested. Look, we see it and we will bite the harm that things like the IMF and the World Bank are subject to things like the Washington Consensus, that they have more of a Western bent, and they have a disproportionate influence in that area, right? But we tell you that we also think that there is a little bit of good faith in the idea that these are actually trying to serve global stability, not just the unilateral interests of one rising hegemon, right? Or that China wishes and imagines itself to be, right? China wants to continue to bully and pull people into its sphere of influence so that they can't have that regional and eventually global influence, right? So I think that at that point, they're also doing things that are fundamentally self-interested. We've seen this with the way that they've done things like development in sub-Saharan Africa, right? Recognize that China was largely doing things like appealing to corrupt governments and giving them extraordinary payouts for those sorts of things, and they were doing really reckless resource extraction that was not in the long-term interest of those particular states, that they were not actually leading to development of those countries in a way that was long-lasting, because they weren't doing things like actually building roads between villages and between various like areas and ports that would actually be useful to all the people within that country, but rather only from where they were like collecting the minerals that they needed to where they were going to process them and ship them out. These are the sorts of conditions that China has already shown through their action, and giving the IIB greater autonomy and forcing them away and not having them be brought into the fold of institutions like the IMF is hugely damaging, not at this time. So, that's why we think there are massive problems with the AIIB. But recognize that we also need to move on to talk about what the true characterization of the IMF is and why we think this is actually far better. I think that OO has a very limited and incorrect characterization that basically says the IMF is bad at doing these development things and they're not really good at changing and adapting to these new conditions, right? I think that this simply isn't true, right? Like we've seen that the IMF can be highly flexible and be able to adapt over time, right? Recognize that they have come out and said that they were wrong about the neoliberal policies that they enforced in the 80s, and they publicly apologized for the way that they approached structural adjustment at that point, right? They have done things like said that there was mistakes in the way that austerity was imposed in places like Greece, right? They've come out and said that there were problems with the way that they structured various resource extraction. I'll give you this time.
Given that the IMF is a monetary policy institution and the AIIB is a development bank, it's not a contradiction to suggest having to earn vast volumes of yuan might affect your monetary policy, but taking out a US dollar denominated loan from the AIIB might not.
So the problem is that they're using institutions like the AIIB and further sphere of influence as a financial and monetary leader to make sure that they're actually not participating in those institutions, right? The AIIB is trying to be a competitor so that they can continue to do things like leverage that people will use them as a reserve currency, right? And we are seeing that this is what countries are starting to do. They're making those things conditional, and it means if the AIIB becomes the sole place for development, that gives them even greater leverage to adopt the currency reserves that China wants them to, right? Because it makes them part of the condition, and they use that as a leverage to actually get people to come into the fold and fulfill exactly what they're looking for. That's the exact problem, right? So to recognize that we think that the IMF is relatively successful in doing things like adapting to these different changes. And we think that the exact problem of the IMF is when they actually try to carry out dogmatic policies that are not reflective of the environment at the time, right? Like this was the problem with the neoliberal approach of the 1980s. The problem is that we are seeing a growing influence of China. This is extraordinarily appealing to many developing countries, and many countries are looking at adopting greater yuan reserve currencies because of the rising influence and because they see the benefits to themselves, right? I think that when you're talking about creating a bipolar economic world, that's hugely damaging at the point that we think that that means that China is far more likely to have far more reckless and unstable interactions, and that we're less likely to see the good guidance and the good sense of consensus decision-making through bodies like the IMF go by the wayside, right? But recognize that this also means that the further you alienate China and other countries as bring under its sphere, it means they're even less likely to do the liberalizing that we already see them trending towards, right? The problem is that China is not going to feel included or legitimated, then they're going to continue to do things like not open up state-owned enterprises, not open up capital flows, those sorts of things. Given we think that that is something that they will need to do in the long term, if we bring them into the fold, we think that it's far more likely that showing that they're legitimate and bringing them into the IMF and having people be able to understand what the influence of having those currencies and what using Chinese currency might mean would be far more beneficial for all. Very kindly proposed.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker and call upon a member of opposition.
The point of an official reserve currency, and I'm surprised no one has mentioned this yet, is that a reserve currency by nature has to be fairly stable, not prone to volatility, and needs to be kept at a rate to ensure that domestic governments aren't able to mess with it to the extent, like due to the structural imbalances in the economy, to the extent that it's going to impact every single other country in the world. The other point of a reserve currency is that when the IMF recognizes you as a reserve currency, it implicitly legitimizes how those currencies are used and how governments manipulate those currencies in order to ensure that their country always comes out on top. And that is why we think, given Chinese domestic policy, as well as the outsized influence that the Bank of China has in setting market rates in terms of their daily fix, that China's currency can absolutely not be used as one of the IMF reserve currencies. I want to do just really quickly with the closing government extension about the AIIB and the IMF. First of all, it's just ridiculous to say that the AIIB is going to be completely unconditional and anarchic, because most of the major global economies are already involved in the AIIB. I think there are something like 4 major holdouts, which are America, Canada, Japan, and something else, all of which are fairly blatantly American allies. You already have countries like the UK, like Germany, like a lot of the EU countries in the AIIB that presumably have an incentive to ensure that conditions are good, etc., etc. Then they say, well, the IMF is just historically better because, they've made mistakes in the past, so now they can learn from it. First of all, it's not mutually exclusive joining the IMF or the AIIB. They target almost completely different things. Admittedly, the IMF has an investment fund, but you can presumably see which one offers you a better deal and then take that one. And second of all, if anything, including China doesn't make it feel other countries feel more included, it's likely to just be a token effort to try and put other countries in, thus stymieing further change within the IMF. We think it's far better to have the AIIB there as a counterbalance. Right, so let me just now characterize China's forex policy to you and tell you exactly why there are structural things within the Chinese economy that means that it's currently unstable and unlikely to get any more stable in the future. No thank you, this is all to do with inherent domestic political troubles within the economy. Right, so for decades, China has a commitment to shifting its economic model from one driven by heavy industry to one driven by consumer and more service-oriented industries, which means that government simultaneously has to make the commitment to making disruptive economic changes and a relaxation of state control. The reason the IMF hasn't allowed the Chinese yuan into the bag of reserve currencies yet is because the Bank of China and the government have taken steps to restrain the market development of those exchange rates by selling forex reserves and continuously setting their daily midpoint for currency lower. And given that you can only trade currency at only 2 percentage points up or down from the midpoint, it means that the government is able to steadily depreciate. So what happened in the Chinese stock market upheaval of August 2015? And why does the Chinese government's reaction to that mean that this is a horrendous idea? When the Chinese stock market collapsed in July, the volatile currency collapsed something like 3%, and global stock markets fell up to 12% and reversed their gains for the year. What does this show? The government might argue that China can deal with upheavals in some way by saying they have strong economic reserves to address shocks. Here's what actually happened, and here's what's likely to happen in the future if the currency gets used. The government had a super vacillating response to the crisis. No thank you. They had uncoordinated monetary easing, huge fiscal stimulus, as well as super heavy-handed intervention into the market, which all undermine confidence in the Chinese market and means that future investors have less of an incentive to step in there, especially because the lack of transparency around those markets keep fueling speculation about what the hell the Bank of China is actually doing. This is reflective of massive structural problems in the Chinese economy, which I'm going to enumerate now. First of all, long-run trends show that the Chinese economy has just been slowing down, and the government has an incentive to ensure that the currency keeps depreciating, or at least is not controlled solely by the market, which means that you always have the interest of the Chinese government to take into account. Why? Because the economy has slowed down for some time, so there's a pressure on the government to take short-run actions in order to shift the markets back to where they want them to be. The incentive to act on the markets is because the economy has collapsed, because believe it or not, the Chinese export market has collapsed 8% a year on year in July 15. No thank you. And therefore, if you weaken the currency, you improve the export market, which explains why the government has an incentive to keep intervening in the market every time the exports fall. This is versus the other currencies that are currently held in reserve by the International Monetary Fund. Those are just simply put more stable because the governments are less heavy-handed in intervening to try and switch market exchange rates around to where they want them to be. This means that in order to prevent global contagion, when your currency collapses, it is just far more important to look at what governments have been doing historically and projecting them to what they probably will do in the future, as opposed to just saying China is strong now and will continue being strong in the future. Moreover, there's also a trend of excessive government lending, which honestly doesn't look set to be fixed anytime soon, along with their massive stock and housing bubbles that just mean that none of their currency is always going to be shifting in a fairly volatile manner up and down the scale. The Chinese government right now has no incentive to fix the currency at a rate dictated by the market. They're always going to be intervening super heavily, which means their currencies are unstable and bad as a bag of reserves. Yeah.
Your case does not stand because main condition of the IMF was to decrease government control and to let market decide what's the value of the currency. So your case does not stand because this is in the decrease.
Yeah, but the Chinese government, like the IMF might not like government controls, but China has government controls. So by your own logic, you shouldn't put Chinese government-controlled currency in the bag of IMF's currency reserves if your point is that the IMF doesn't like currency controls. And even if that were the case and the government claims in China claims that it's stepping back, it's still not market control. Like I just told you, the Bank of China gets to set daily fixes around 2 p.m. every day. Right, so let's talk about global contagion really quickly. We're also talking about not just like the countries in the world that hold Chinese currencies as a bag of reserves, but also about emerging markets, which are already threatened by the reduced Chinese demand for their goods as well as the industrial world. Why is this bad? Because they're already under heavy levels of macroeconomic stress as well as structural instability, so increasing the instability by them could potentially lead to further global contagion, so it has worse outcomes if we believe OG's policy that these countries will automatically opt into using Chinese reserves because that decreases their interest rate on loans. Ultimately, the point of a reserve currency is to ensure that you can kind of predict what it's going to do. At the point when the Chinese government can step in at any minute, as shown by the structural problems with the economy and the long-term trends of what the government has done, the Chinese currency is absolutely not fit for the IMF's reserve currency.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker and call upon the governor to look us off the government side.
So one thing's for sure, UP can't seem to agree about what's going on with the AIIB. So the leader of the opposition comes up here and he says that the AIIB is a good developmental source within the world and it's probably an alternative to the IMF, which is tremendously dogmatic and has no political incentives to ever change, therefore it's a good thing, it's been developing. Tom gets up and he says that it's going to be competing against the World Bank, but in a way that we can't really predict because there's too many stakeholders involved. Then Ending comes up and says it's basically going to be like every other international institution because so many people are involved. All of these can't be true, right? It can't simultaneously be a tremendously effective means of being a counterbalancing to the IMF, but also hold all of the international goals that everyone in the community who is stakeholders of the IMF believe in, but then also be something that's completely inscrutable. At that point, it's unclear to the government bench about what they're actually defending on their side of the house and what their international vision is. The one thing UP can seem to agree upon is that China's economy is super damn toxic, so we better keep them out of the world. But guys, I'm sorry, but despite the egghead economist world of the opposition, currency is not the main reason there are shocks to the international economy, right? The integration of the international economy is probably going to have a lot more to do with the fact that China's not importing commodities anymore, right? Or that they're changing from an export economy. Those are going to be the real things that influence the world, and it's exactly the kind of abstracted currency manipulation and pretending that we can isolate ourselves from shocks using the tools of economists that fails to realize that it's actually better to have honest integration and an honest statement of the ways in which these economies are linked. That's why you're going to be voting for government within this round. The first question is, what is China's actual present role in the economy, or how do we resolve the massive contradictions going on in opposition? What we've said to you is that China is, to some extent, a good faith operator within the international economy who has different intentions for how they think currency should operate and how economies should function. They are a competitor to the Bretton Woods organizations because they don't believe that all of their requirements of structural adjustment are necessarily good. They've also found an interest then in being the kind of lendee to the developing world who doesn't have those requirements. But what's the impact of that? Those relationships already existed prior to the AIIB. They are lendees to those nations. Those nations have specific debt obligations to China, which means that they need to have the yuan as a reserve currency in their relationship to China. It's already de facto happening in those economies. The question is, does the IMF continue to shame those individuals and say, it's bad you went down this route we did not agree upon, or is it potentially better to recognize the situation that is existing and legitimated for the IMF
IMF's other goals. This is the fundamental debate within this round, is that other people are using the yuan in certain ways that we find completely uncomfortable due to the nature of China being a separate kind of financial institution, and in the move forward, is it good for the IMF to continue to protest against that or to make some kind of concession so there can be integration of those two? So what do we think the IMF's long-run goals ought to be? What Taylor tells you is that at the point that we know that a continual bifurcation of the international economy is primarily people just putting their heads in the sand or hoping that a new kind of organization is going to change things, and unfortunately falling into the very economic fallacies we see along the opposition bench where we can't actually make clear predictions about which kinds of development are going to be effective. We think it's better for the IMF to, rather than have the Washington consensus be its primary goals, which means says these are specific ways you should organize the liberalization of your economy, you should have certain kinds of currencies, and being a dogmatic dictator of how the economy ought to function, they ought to accept the fact that the world has changed. There has been a sea change against them as an institution, and it's actually on the onus is upon them to bring those nations back into the fold. Because the IMF's primary goal is not just tinkering with the economies through structural adjustment, it's also just surveillance, right? It's trying to make long-run economic predictions about what's going to happen to provide data to the world. The fact is, even the Palestinian Authority gives economic data to the IMF because people want a desire for us to be able to make reasonable long-run predictions about these things, and it's far worse when, as they say on their side of the house, the Bretton Woods organizations are actually being edged out, and people are no longer having any kind of faith in them fundamentally. Because the problem is the premise of international economics needs to not always be a claim that your previous models were effective, but ideally some kind of humility in the long run. And this is the point of Taylor's argumentation about this. Remember that they have this strange is-ought fallacy on their side, where like, well, the IMF would never do this because it's not the kind of thing they would do, because they're not the kind of people who do that kind of thing. But remember, that's just a terrible is-ought fallacy when Taylor even tells you they've admitted resource extraction under a liberalized free market system does not change poverty, and they changed one of the fundamental standards of structural adjustment. The question is then, if the IMF and the World Bank can change themselves, should they continue to pretend that they're natural economic competitors with China and keep China isolated when that isolation is a pure fiction? And just because they're claiming that we don't invest in China as much, that doesn't mean that the real economic effects of Chinese integration throughout the world aren't going to have shocks. It's better to have the economic system reflect that and have our best economists in the world evaluate that and have the capability to do so. Go for it, Tom.
Given that the AIIB allows us to tap different funding sources to the World Bank, why is it contradictory to believe that there are benefits to having two similar but subtly different organizations giving more loans than before?
Because the problem is that the nature of those loans has been fundamentally different from the IMF. So the reason why the distinction is happening is because they have different goals and different kinds of conditionality. The reason why you're comfortable protecting that distinction is because you're happy having the IMF being similarly dogmatic and admitting they ought to be wrong. What we're saying is, rather than letting that distinction go, make the concession you might be wrong and allow the institutions to actually come together, rather than having a dogmatic individual presenting that there's a certain way of allowing the world to work, then you admit that ought to be wrong and there should be an alternative. It's not clear why you shouldn't just have the IMF concede that they're wrong then and not have this kind of bifurcation. That's the crux of the closing government extension, which is that this bifurcation is one primarily of politics and primarily one of a doubt and a holding your heads in the sand about the reality of how economies ought to work, rather than the fact that we have a different kind of integration, a different nature of currencies moving forward. So, fundamentally, why is recognizing the yuan the resolution for both worlds, and how does it highlight the causal fallacy of the closing opposition? Because on their side, they basically say that this is going to be unstable for decades, and these shocks will be catastrophic, and we have the yuan within the economy. But we say that on our side of the house that the IMF should have reactive stakeholders. They should have individuals who are aware that these kinds of threats are going to happen, and we challenge the premise that it's going to be having more people hold the yuan as the pegged currency that is going to be the primary means of stimulating that kind of instability. Rather, what we say on our side of the house is that recognizing the yuan and its present role within the world promotes an international stability of a recognition of the way we are going. Look, the way you have to weigh this debate is at the point that we don't really have a clear conception from opposition about what the proper goals of development are and what are the actual sources of stability or instability within the world. It's far better to have a system that rejects the core bifurcation, which they fail to justify in their side of the house, and at times justify merely as a fact rather than a question as principle. I think that we can all concede that the facts in this debate might be particularly pernicious to evaluate, but it seems then that at that point it's better to have an integration of an awareness of the way this currency has been used rather than assuming it ought to be not used that way when any kinds of attempts at leverage and promoting that have obviously failed up to this point and are going to continue to fail in the future. For all these reasons, tremendously proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker and tell us about the opposition witness to lead this debate.
that? But yes,
Around 5.
Okay, right. Two issues I want to talk about today. Firstly, on appreciation and depreciation. Secondly, who better deals with China and what an ideal world of China actually looks like within side opposition's case. Firstly, appreciation or depreciation. What occurs? What is good? Now, Anthony very simply told you that Chinese responses to the market crash was to throw money at appreciating the RMB in order to make up for the crash, in order to make up for the massive depreciation. That at large, China practices massive amounts of monetary manipulation, countervailing to every single other person because of two things. One, they have to prevent a crash. Two, they have to ensure that their export market continues to function, meaning that they have an interest to ensure that the yuan continues to be low. Meaning that at large, we don't think that OG's benefit of a sudden inflation leading to a cheapening of debt is likely to occur. More importantly than that, however, we think that at large, the Chinese instability and continued tampering with the yuan is likely to lead to two possible outcomes. Firstly, stagflation, a dangerous appreciation that crashes the Chinese export market because very simply put, they can't keep doing this forever and ever and ever. And the more the Chinese economy is integrated into everyone else's, the more likely the massive appreciation, a consequent drop in Chinese ability to export and therefore their ability to maintain a stable economy at large is going to be destroyed. But secondly then, an even worse outcome, the hyperinflation crash, that once they lose out control of the yuan, that at large we think the yuan depreciates massively, and then all the other economies that are tied to the yuan at large by this greater amount of reserve currency at large also end up getting their currency devalued. And that's why we think that whether or not it appreciates or depreciates doesn't matter, so much as the instability of the yuan and the continued tampering of it is likely to lead to consequences that are really, really bad for everyone. Second issue that we have to talk about then, who better deals with China? Now let's note for a moment now that closing government's extension that China is an asshole is premised on whether integrating them into the IMF can regulate China, i.e. whatever opening government wanted to talk about. Here's where we have a comparative. The IMF and the AIIB versus the AIIB competing with the IMF. And let's take this stance all the way in closing opposition. We would rather that the West simply buy them out or compete with them via the TTP, via the TPP, and other trade federations, Star Wars reference, trade federations that continue to exist in the world today. That China at large, being in the system of the IMF, is likely to lead to far greater damage because then they are in the system, having sunk their claws into these domestic economies in the developing world, ready to destroy them and do whatever they want with their currency manipulations again. So we don't think that this is going to be good. Rather, we expect that the IMF, if they want to liberalize, as government seems to want, if they want to stop shaming these people, rather than bringing China into the fold, it should be more about ensuring these people whom China or the AIIB is going to lend money to or is going to help develop becomes the patrons of IMF instead. And that's why we think competition is going to be a better deal. Because Anthony said that in the end, the most important thing is that people get attracted to the IMF. Not necessarily to say that the IMF is going to be better than China, but if China is going to be a nice person, if China is going to be stabilized, it's not true the IMF, which China doesn't actually have to agree to, or doesn't have to agree to your standards when making deals with those individual countries. Rather, we think it means that China has to be nice. China has to make sure that the AIIB is stable and its own currencies are stable, that it stops manipulating to the extent it does now in order to compete with the IMF. And that's when we think that China is likely to play ball. That's when we think that China is likely to become more stable, because it means that they are getting people, it means that people are more likely to patronize them than the IMF. And again, the premise of opening opposition is that the Chinese government doesn't give a shit about integration and caring about the use of the renminbi. OG says that the use of IMF integration is supposed to make China better by using IMF regulations. What we have shown exclusively is why the Chinese government's domestic policy is likely to, one, lead to bad outcomes, but two, more importantly, that integrating them into this is likely to decrease the good competition or the regulations, or the market forces that would create a better China. Let's further then break a deadlock that's occurring between closing government and OO. Will China hurt people? Is the AIIB actually good? In closing opposition, we think that the former is likely to happen, that China is likely to hurt people. However, should the latter happen, that the AIIB is actually good, that China becomes responsible, that yes, it's fine and good, that people will then move towards AIIB and the whole new world order that closing government seems to want is going to occur, and it would be a good thing. But you don't do that by bringing China into the fold of the IMF. You do that by ensuring they compete. You do that by ensuring they stop doing the crazy asshole things that my speaker told you about. And that's why we think that should a belligerent China occur, and this is the even if, should a belligerent China occur, that we are even better placed to combat them than the side of government is. Because we reduce the amount, we reduce the degree of power that China has, and therefore the amount of influence that its currency manipulations, possible crashes and instabilities could do. Opening.
Thank you. Do you have more control over China when you have power balance within the voting system of IMF, or when you have majority vote of just China in Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank?
Okay, one, even China goes via the IMF to throw yuan at people, it doesn't necessarily mean that their own domestic policy and currency manipulation is going to change at all. That secondly, even if you have all these regulations, that we on the comparative thing, that we move towards a greater and better new world order and curtail China's influence by outcompeting them or attempting to, and that if they actually can outcompete us in terms of being nice people, that's a good thing for the global economy at large. Let's bring this to a conclusion. What have we proven to you on site closing opposition? Firstly, we've proven to you that China is a really bad actor in general, that instability of its currency is likely to lead to knock-on effects that are likely to trash up the developing and domestic economies that everyone seems to want to help. But on the second level, we showed you that in our scenario on site opposition, that the best way forward is likely to curtail China via the use of competition or move towards the New World Order that the government wants via the use of competition again. And that at large then, we can use many other ways to curtail China and ensure they move towards a better place for the entire global economy. For all those reasons, go with CEO.
I'd like to thank all the speakers, and that's for
First time you said that.